All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Sacred to Secular podcast. I'm your host, Jack Adams, and I am thrilled today to be joined by Britt Hartley. Hi, Britt.
Hi,
Thanks for being on the podcast today. I'm a huge fan of your work, so I've been looking forward to this.
it's my
So,
pleasure.
yeah. So, for those that might be new, maybe to this space, Britt is an atheist spiritual director, has a coaching practice that helps people with their spirituality. She's a podcaster, a YouTuber, and probably, I'm going to say most importantly, you may disagree, but the author of this book here, the No Nonsense Spirituality, which we'll talk about a little bit today. And was a book that was really impactful in my life. So that's a little intro to Britt. I don't know if you'd add anything. Am I missing
That's
anything?
great. Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, let's just go into it.
Okay. Cool. Well, having your life distilled down to a few sentences probably doesn't do you justice. I would suggest anyone that wants to learn a little bit more about Brit, go to the Mormon Stories podcast and listen to episode, I believe it's 1840. I have it written down here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that is the longest
40.
episode that I've done like on my life. So even, people who aren't anywhere on the Mormon spectrum, I still send people to that episode if you want my life story for whatever reason.
Yeah, it definitely talks about Mormonism, but you don't have to have any context around Mormonism to watch it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, definitely goes through all of Brit's life. So if you want a little bit more information about who she is, what she does, why she does what she does, I would highly suggest you listen to that. So, all right. So I guess to start, just continuing along with this introduction, why is the three words put together, atheist spiritual director, not an oxymoron in your opinion?
Yeah, in fact, I kind of almost use those words on purpose as an oxymoron just so that like people will be confused enough to give me a minute to explain myself.
Yeah.
So I a little bit do that facetiously on purpose. Um, but essentially, I have a master's degree in theology, almost doctorate in theology. I really spent the majority of my adult life studying these deeper philosophical and religious questions of just like what are we, what is the point of this, what are we doing here. That's always been since I was probably 15 years old. That's really been kind of the driving engine of my life. And so what happened then is in theology school, not only did I lose faith in Mormonism at one point and Christianity and religion in general, but I eventually lost my faith in God, which is not that uncommon in theology school. It happens more than you would think. But I did lose my faith in God in theology school, and so I'm stuck with this strange experience that all of my knowledge and experience is around spirituality and religion and wisdom traditions and mysticism. But now I no longer believed in God and no longer could be like a chaplain under Christianity or something like that because I no longer believed in the truth claims. So what do I do with that? And essentially, I had this sense that even if there was no God, there was still so much good things in here that I had learned in my 20 years exploring this space, ritual and awe and contemplation and love and wisdom and inspiration and all the things that religions provide. And is there a way I can do it without God because I no longer believed in God? And so I did an 18-month spiritual direction program with the Center for Non-Religious Spirituality to essentially be able to carve out a tiny space where if you feel like you need deep help with questions like death and what is the point of life and what am I doing and what I am I and how do I formulate the good life and how do I do it without faith or how do I do it where maybe I don't know how I feel about God. I've kind of found a niche in that space by saying, I'll help you with that. I have a lot of tools I've gathered to help you with that, but I'm not going to force you into any kind of faith in any direction because I just personally don't have any belief in God. So the best way I can say all of that is atheist spiritual director and spiritual director that's, an actual certification, but I'm trying to do it in a way that doesn't demand faith because that just feels more authentic to me. And those are the people that then would come to me for spiritual direction.
Yeah, I think a lot of people personally that I've talked to, and myself personally as well, kind of relate to this sense that when we transition out of religion and we've gone through deconstruction or continuing to deconstruct, there's this sense of lacking uh, in secularism, and us that grew up, in very strict religions or even just normal religions miss that sense of spirituality that we used to get from the religion. And that's one of the most difficult, that along with loss of community can be some of the most difficult things to deal with. So I think a lot of people are starting to resonate with this. I imagine it's been a difficult space to be in. It's maybe not as exciting as the deconstruction topics, right? And criticizing churches and things like that. But I
Yeah,
do think
it's
it's a really
really
important
fun.
work.
Yeah. No, you're right. It is really fun sometimes in a self-righteous way to just bash religion, right? Like you can go in with just like Christopher Hitchens' attitude and just like, and I can do it. Like I can put that on and just obliterate religion. But what we're realizing is that as we're kind of running out of the burning building of religion, there is a cliff here that I feel like we don't talk about enough in deconstruction, which is, and some people deconstruct religion and they're really off and running and they seem to do just fine. But there's a lot of people like me where like I really lost everything, my identity, my belonging, my sense of morality, my sense of purpose, my sense of meaning. And my brain just kind of started to shut down in that because it didn't know what to do anymore. I have all the old thought patterns of religion. I don't have a new life yet, and I'm finding a lot of people who get stuck in that space. So it's meaningful work, but perhaps not as fun as the angry atheist phase, which can be super self-righteous.
Absolutely. I was reading Brave New World by, I'm
Mm.
going to botch his name, Aldous Huxley.
Hmm.
I think that's how you pronounce it. For the second time. The first time I read it, I was still a religious person, and the second time, just recently, about a
Mm.
month ago, I finished it. I'm not anymore. I'm an atheist as well, and it was really interesting. Toward the end of the book, if you've read it,
Hmm.
there's this dialogue back and forth between kind of the director of this new age city where everything is taken care of. It's everything is maximized for maximum pleasure and comfort. And this other person who's now living in this new age city, who is someone that grew up in more of like a environment that like an indigenous American would have grown up in, right? And this indigenous person says, "I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness." And it was really poignant reading that, kind of post religion. I'm curious, and
Mm.
based on what you've just said, I think I know the answer, but is there a space for people who don't believe in God anymore to still want those things? And why do you think it's important that we do want those things?
Yeah. It's the answer is yes and no. So do people build post-religion spiritual and communal lives? The answer is yes. Everyone I've seen who has done that successfully, including myself, does that piecemeal. Meaning, I have my karate group with my kids, and I have that group. I have like a post-Mormon group in Boise. I have like a couple girlfriends. I have maybe an exercise group. I have maybe a seekers group where we talk about philosophical things. I have some online spaces. So I definitely would say like I live a service-filled communal life, but is it one place like it used to be? No, it's all over the place. And that's kind of what we're tending to see. And the problem that we're running up against, and this bothers some atheists when I talk about it because they'll start to say that I'm sounding like Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson, but I think we have to be honest about it that without shared myths, we don't really form strong communities. And if secular humanism and or atheism doesn't have strong enough myths and stories that are really sticky, that really get people to give their time and resources, we're never going to see something like Mormonism that's secular. I don't even know if it's really possible given human nature. And so that's a problem. That's a problem that we're running up against. And so it seems to be that your choices are to be a part of a religion or spiritual tradition and deconstruct it so that it's healthy, or you kind of build that up piecemeal from the other side of the spectrum. And you can end up in a similar place. I've always said that the most deconstructed Christian and the most spiritual atheist, like the difference between them is really not that much. So I think people can do that, but I don't think that we're ever going to have something like the community that we experienced with Mormonism without dogma, without shared myths. And that's a problem for the secular world that a lot of people in my space we talk about all the time. How do we combat this? And no one's quite figured it out, to be honest. I've watched. It was part of my master's degree program to study atheist or secular churches, people who are like, let's do all the best that churches do and just leave all the bullshit. And they last about 5 years. And then they just don't have enough money. And then people say, I could go to church, but I could watch Netflix. And just without that dogma, without that pressure, without that fear of hell, without that demand of 10% of tithing or else God's going to be mad at you, it just seems like we can't fully compete with religion in that way. And I just think we have to be honest about that reality.
Yeah, it's almost the argument, and this is probably why people are accusing you of sounding like Jordan Peterson, but it's that argument that uh, Dostoevsky made in Crime and Punishment, right? Where without God, we're all our own moral arbiters, and humans really
Yeah.
suck at being their own moral arbiters, right? And I think this is the place I found myself in after deconstructing Mormonism. I told my wife, I said, Mormonism's the only thing that's keeping my belief in God alive. And
Mm.
so it was very quickly after that that I kind of slipped into nihilism, which I'm hoping we can talk about a little bit today.
Yeah.
When you've kind of come to that realization that you just said that we kind of need this organizational structure, but I can't physically force myself to believe in these truth claims anymore. Why do you think that causes nihilism? And I guess more broadly, what is nihilism for those that don't know what that means?
Yeah, so we'll back that question up because that was yeah, that had a bunch of parts in there. So
Sure.
nihilism is just an ism, it's a philosophy that says that there's no inherent meaning in the universe. Now, for some people, that's a positive thing. So we can get optimistic nihilism, we can get pessimistic nihilism. So there's nothing in nihilism inherently that says that that's a good idea or a bad idea. It's just stating, hey, the universe doesn't give a shit that you're here. Like
Right.
that's really all that it's doing. And in my experience, I find that there's five, I used to do four, but I think there's five ways that I'm finding people who end up in nihilism. Five kind of paths of people who end up in this space where it's all pointless, nothing matters. Morality is an illusion. Meaning and purpose is an illusion. This is just an evolutionary machine. There's no point to any of this. Okay. So, how do people get there? One would be how you and I got there, which is all of a sudden this foundation of faith that was your meaning and purpose and how you viewed the world and your identity and your belonging and your morality. We all built that. You and I built that on religious ideas and a foundation. And so, when that floor dropped, it's like you're a 40-year-old newborn baby, at least for me. Like it's like you have no way to look at the world. You have no way to orient. You have no anchors. All you have is deconstruction. All you have is like postmodernism where the closer you look for truth, the more you realize that there is no truth. And it can just be very psychologically debilitating. So that's probably the majority of clients that I see are people who resonate with my story because they also come from religion and that floor dropped for them too. But I also get people who are secular and were not raised in religion. Another path there is just philosophy and deep thinking. If you are always questioning, what is the root of this question? Why? If you've just always been that person, that's like a one-way street that dead ends in nihilism, I feel like. Because if you are consistently tearing apart things in order to get to ultimate truth, you'll realize that truth is I don't even know if we're interacting with ultimate truth. And that those deep thinkers will often end up in nihilism. Sometimes they can, have the tools to be able to go through it very easily and it's fine for them, but it is kind of the dead end for deep thinking and philosophy. Another path there is if you're a deep feeler and you're very sensitive to suffering. So my favorite example of this, it's terrible, but I think it shows the kind of people who end up here. It was the photographer, I forget his name, and he had this famous photograph of the starving Sudanese boy with the vulture behind him. It's very famous, won a Pulitzer Prize, and 3 months later, that photographer ended his own life. Just could not reconcile the kind of suffering that he saw when he was in Sudan. And so I'll see people who come to nihilism who aren't necessarily deep thinkers, but they are deep feelers and have no container to hold suffering. Another path would be psychedelics, where you take a mushroom and realize what you thought you were and what you thought the world is a lot of, cognitive biases and cognitive shortcuts, and that can throw people into the void. And then the last one is just like capital T trauma. So people who have seen things that no one should ever have to see will start to question what's the point of it all, just because of the level of trauma that they've experienced. So often my nihilistic clients will have a combination of those things. They've lost an anchor. They're thinking deeply, they're feeling deeply. Maybe they've dabbled in some psychedelics. They've either have some trauma or are aware of trauma, and that combination tends to be, some combination of that tends to be the majority of the nihilistic clients that I see.
Interesting. Yeah, I think prior to hearing that, I maybe had the incorrect assumption that most nihilists were post-religious people. I've never
No,
seen any
I would
statistics
say,
around that,
yeah.
but
I would say the crisis of it you see with religious people because they truly have nothing. Like for me, like you're 30 years old, you have nothing. You don't know who you are. You really you don't know how to face death. You really are a newborn baby. So the crisis of it we see with religious people, and what we see more with secular people is like an ache, a hunger, a dissatisfaction. I'm drinking too much at night and I don't really know why. So it's more of that. It's not as much of a crisis because they've always kind of been in the secular space. They've never had a grounded morality in God or anything like that. And so they've built up some ways to adjust to a secular world, but they'll just be kind of like a deep hunger, a deep ache, some numbing going on, some dissatisfaction, but it's not quite the crisis mode that we see from people coming from religion is what we tend to see.
an interesting reframing the kind of the positive, optimistic side of nihilism and the pessimistic side. I think um, recently, actually, on Mormon Stories again, you mentioned that both fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, and nihilism, I'm guessing pessimistic nihilism is what you meant. Both of those things will kill you. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is again going to sound a little Jordan Peterson-esque because he does a lot of order and chaos, but there's something to what he's saying there. And this idea is bigger than him, but he's the one who probably talks about it the most nowadays. But there is this sense of how humans don't do well with too much order and we don't do well with too much chaos. We seem to do best when we have some order and structure with some room to grow. like our nervous systems tend to do best when we're in that kind of situation. So fundamentalism is too much order. It suffocates you. It's how I felt at the end of my time in Mormonism, where I just felt like a plant that had grown out of its pot, and I just like it felt suffocating. Like, why do I have to do these things this way? This is illogical. Like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense for my life. And it can just it can suffocate you that in that way. And then fundamentalism, as far as violence, tends to be more others violent than nihilism is, meaning, you can believe that God is on your side and be a Lori Daybell, or you can believe God is on your side and go on a religious crusade. So fundamentalism, too much order. We're so sure that God is on our side that we will essentially do anything. Nihilism is different. It tends to be less others violent in the sense that there's not as many crusades, but we do get violence for the self. So like suicide or slow suicide. But also, if you look at the journals of like school shooters, which is a really dark rabbit hole if you ever go down, if you read the journals of the Columbine shooters, there is this sense of like deep nihilism that they didn't have enough tools to be able to wrestle with and handle, and almost a morality that school shooters have created, that the most moral thing to do is to kill yourself and take as many people out with you. So both ends of the spectrum, whether it be the suicide, slow suicide, school shooting of nihilism, or the crusades, fundamentalism, soul crushing, for lack of a better word, side of religious fundamentalism, both those are bad news for human well-being. And so what we ultimately want of everyone is that space in between, where we have some order, some structure, some meaning, some purpose, some moral education, some rituals, some sense of the sacred, and also room to grow and room to be flexible and room to nuance and room to allow other people to think differently than you and that kind of thing. And we have to come at this out from both sides. So secularism has to build up tools for the secular side, and religions need to curb the worst of its own fundamentalist behavior. And so we actually need to come at this from both sides.
Interesting. So you see it as a joint effort, not necessarily separated.
Uh, like begrudgingly, yes, because I have to admit that religion, because of how powerful it is for our brains and how we've co-evolved with religion, and just because of the amount of money and resources that it can produce, we just have to recognize that if you want to do a battle between religion and secularism, I do think religion will win. I really do. And so I essentially have to invite religion into this problem because it's just going to exist whether I want it to or not. And so essentially, I want religion to get better for all the people who are in it, and I want secularism to get better for all the people who are in it. And eventually, that has to be my goal.
Not everyone that goes through some sort of deconstruction process, and I know you always say you're never really done deconstructing, but let's say you've deconstructed, past tense Mormonism or Islam or something. Not everyone that does that necessarily becomes atheist, becomes a nihilist, and atheist and nihilist aren't even the same thing either, obviously.
Hmm.
But a lot of people do. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it really depends on a couple things. It depends on, for one, how much you're suffering. So if you're neurotic, so if you're like me, if I'm high in introversion and high in neuroticism, which neuroticism is just your brain's ability to ruminate about bad things, and you kind of have some pessimism, if that's kind of your natural brain state, then you tend to need more structure and support. So when you lose that in religion, or you lose that when you leave religion, that will be that will be pessimistic nihilism for you. For many people who inherently enjoy life, And I would say, like in the Mormon space, this would be like David Bokovoy, who has a very different kind of nihilism for me. His nihilism is like, there's no meaning in the universe. This is fucking fantastic. And he's climbing mountains and he's got his job that gives him a lot of meaning and purpose. He's like so happy. Alan Mount, I would consider in that category too, if you're coming from the if you're listening to this from the Mormon space, where these people just inherently enjoy life. And so they just don't need very much. Oh, there's no ultimate meaning in the universe. That's fine. I'm enjoying life. I'm just going to enjoy life for as long as this ride is. If you are fundamentally not enjoying life, nihilism is a problem. Nihilism is a problem. And so it tends to be people who are more on the depression scale, people who have anxiety, people who have neuroticism, people who are high in introversions, because a lot of happiness is just extroversion minus neuroticism. It just tells you how much your brain is going to suffer in life. So a lot of it just depends on how much do you suffer. So for someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is very famous in the space because she was the fifth member of the atheist apocalypse, and she's rubbing shoulders with Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett. And she has this, but she's struggling. She's struggling in secularism. She's having depression. She's having these dark nights of the soul. A lot of what is the meaning of this? What is the purpose? What do we do here? And so she finds herself converting to Christianity. And when you listen to her talk about it, she doesn't she didn't have like an emotional conversion. She didn't have like a vision where Jesus came to her or had some big come to Jesus moment. She just needed something and walked into a Christian church and just kind of said, I don't really understand it. I don't really rationally make sense of all of this, but this is good for me. And that's what we tend to see with people who struggle is that they're already suffering. So nihilism is a problem. So they end up either clinging to some new ism or the nihilism will start to drown them is what I tend to see.
I think Alex O'Connor did an interview with her recently, and I was so excited to listen to it because if I'm being honest, there's still that part of me that would love to be wrong, that would love to go
Mm,
back to at least Christianity, right?
mm,
There's still a big part of me that would like to go back to Mormonism, if it weren't for the harm that I think it causes people. But um, I listened to that and I was like, please tell me something that I haven't thought of.
yeah.
And
Hmm.
I did get that sense that she just needed something. And
She just needed something.
it was really
Yeah.
beautiful to listen to, honestly.
My
Um,
issue with it, other than like the betrayal of like, you know that part in Ocean's 11 where they're like, you shook Sinatra's hand, like you
that's
should
right.
know
Yep.
better.
Yep.
You sat with Hitch. What
Yep.
the hell are you doing? So when I get past like my initial betrayal, and I listen to her, it really feels to me like a failure of secularism that we didn't have enough resources in secularism to help with her nihilism. And now she has to be in Christianity and she has completely compartmentalized, which is the part of her faith that I really don't like because what she had to do is say, because I need these things, I'm going to turn to Christianity and I'm going to leave my rationality. I'm going to compartmentalize it so that it's operating in a different space. And what I don't like about that is I just don't think that will ever lead to wholeness when you have to compartmentalize your emotional needs and your rational mind. So for me right now, my spiritual life is able to have rationality in like at that table. And for me, that's just brought me a lot more wholeness. And so my question for Ayaan Hirsi Ali or my question for Rainn Wilson, who did something similar, he had a period of nihilism and atheism and he just jumped back to his childhood religion and now he's a Baha'i. I just want to ask them like, if you had better tools, if you could have a very vibrant spiritual life, would you have had to make this move where rationally you say you don't make sense and you have to kind of compartmentalize your rationality? If we would have had better tools, would you have had to make that move? And I wonder that for both of them. Yeah. Because I just don't know if that will ever fully lead to wholeness, because that just feels really compartmentalized to me.
Agreed. It's difficult for someone who does want that spirituality back. But it would be like asking right now, I'm open to having my mind changed, but it'd be like asking me to believe that the sky was green and not blue. I can say that I do, but it doesn't mean that I actually do believe that, right? And
Mm.
so it's difficult, and I agree. I wonder if we just had better tools, is there a better space, for spirituality and rationalism to coexist, which is what you do. So, um,
It's what I do, but I also have to like admit my privilege here that like most people have to do this on the side, like between
yeah,
10 and 10:30 at night in their minds. Whereas like I've had the ability for this to be my job. And so I've had the opportunity to build up these things in my life because I've been able to look at the data and talk to people and try things and study with people. And I recognize that that's a huge privilege on my part. But when we talk about privilege, it's like, yes, that's a privilege, but it's a privilege I want everyone to have so that they don't have to jump into a religion that doesn't rationally make sense to them just to be able to survive life and being a human. Like I want that privilege for everyone, essentially.
yeah, agreed. One last question before we jump into maybe a reframing of nihilism, or maybe a tool set, that people can use. You mentioned that oftentimes this pessimistic nihilism translates into forms of self-violence, sometimes others violence, but a lot of times self-violence. What are those symptoms? What do they look like? Because when I was experiencing it, I didn't have even the vocabulary to know what nihilism was, and you actually played a big role in kind of helping me understand what was happening to me.
Mm,
So what do these symptoms look like? What someone that's going through this, what is their
yeah.
behavior like?
Yeah, so things to look for is first some kind of dissociation. So this is so much for your brain because it has no psychological anchors anymore. It has no social or personal psychological anchors. And so it's just too much. You can't even when you're fully in nihilism and you have no sense of like up or down or right or wrong or who you are or what you want to do, there's no way to make a decision. So it's like complete analysis paralysis. And your brain doesn't like to be there. And so it'll start to check out. Now, check out can mean dissociate. Uh, check out can mean depression, where you just shut down. Check out can mean I'm starting to eat more gummies at night and drink every night, and I don't really know why. But it's some kind of checkout, some kind of shutdown. And the majority of the nihilistic clients that I see aren't in the vast majority are not in active suicide ideation, meaning they don't have a plan. And I wouldn't be the person. I refer them. I would refer them at that point to people who are better trained than me for active suicide plans. So it's not. It tends to not be that. It tends to be. I don't have an active plan. I have people around me that I care about, that kind of thing, but I don't have any will to live. I don't have any reason to live. I don't have any reason to get out of bed. I only do the times that I absolutely have to. So what we see is just like you're in bed, lots of numbing behaviors, you're depressed, you're dissociated, your body shut down. You don't feel pleasure anymore. You have anhedonia. Your brain can't even feel pleasure anymore. And you can't feel motivation anymore. And so it's not so much like I have a plan and you're calling me because I'm not the person for that phone call. It's more so that like they'll hear my story or hear something that I say and sign up for a coaching session. I don't have an active suicide plan, but I have no reason to live. Like if I'm on a plane and it's going down, I am not resisting that at all. It's like, thank God, it's over. It's more of that. The most dangerous part of suicide is when you get the morality question, where some people get into, myself included, thought loops where it starts to make sense where suicide is the most rational and or moral thing to do. And that tends to be very, very dangerous. That would be the most dangerous edge of nihilism that I would work with, where not only you have checked out of life, but you now feel like it is the most moral or best thing to do to fully check out of life. And that would be the most dangerous edge of nihilism. Yeah.
Can almost get to this point where you feel as though you're participating in a system that you're constantly causing
Yes.
violence on animals and the planet itself and other people
Yes.
unintentionally just with the products that you purchase and child labor. And yeah, it's a really dark place. It's not
Yeah.
something I'd wish on anyone.
That dark, I wouldn't wish that place on my worst enemy. I tell people that I would never wish nihilism on anyone, but selfishly, sometimes I'm glad for the company. And perhaps that's a little selfish, but it's honest. Like it's honest that I would never give this pill to someone. I would never force this upon anyone. I barely survived it myself in some ways.
Hmm.
If I didn't have children, I don't know if I would have. But knowing that other people have honestly looked at these questions and been to these places and have found tools to make it to the other side, even though I wouldn't wish that on them, I'm very grateful for all those who made it through the void and left some helpful hints and tips for all those who are in it.
Well, it's a perfect transition into one such person that I
Yeah,
wanted to talk to you about today.
yeah.
So, kind of in my dark night of the soul, I guess we'll call it, I picked this book up, right?
Mm,
The Myth of Sisyphus. And it really kind of transformed and reframed the way that I looked at the world and kind of my existentialism, and though I didn't know it at the time, that the nihilism that I was experiencing. And I know that Camus has been a big influence on your life as well. So I guess just kind of as a brief introduction, who is Albert Camus, and what was kind of going on in the world when he was writing?
yeah, let's talk about him. Like for many of people in nihilism, he can be kind of a safe landing platform. But as we'll talk about later, I don't think he offers us a complete philosophy. It's just more so of a landing spot when you feel like you're in free fall.
Absolutely.
Uh, so Camus, he's born in Nigeria in 1913. He grew up poor and fatherless. He lived through World War II. He saw the rise of fascism, the fallout of colonialism. He's a part of all of this kind of postmodernism. He's a journalist, a novelist, a philosopher. He's a fantastic writer. He wins the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957 at the age of 44. So he's coming of age during the era of mass existential crisis, the Holocaust, totalitarian regimes, warfare. He's seeing Nietzsche's prediction that when God dies, the first thing that's going to fill that vacuum is political religions as we try to make sense of the death of God. And Camus is definitely baked into that happening in the 20th century. So other people turn to Marxism or existentialism, and Camus kind of charted his own path through this existential crisis in philosophy that we now call absurdism. So as opposed to Sartre, who just says like we need to create our own meaning, that's more like existentialism. Kierkegaard would be in that too. And then Nietzsche, who says God is dead, but we need to overcome nihilism through self-creation and living according to your core values. What Camus will do is different than a leap to some kind of system and also refusing suicide. And so what he does is his philosophy recognizes what he calls the absurd. And what the absurd is this clash between where these humans that desire justice and clarity and order and meaning, and the universe doesn't give a shit. And there's an absurdity. How could we come from this universe and have this desire for justice and order and meaning, and the universe have none to give us? And that is an absurd situation that we find ourselves in. And so essentially his approach is we're not going to deny the absurd. We're going to sit with it. We're going to accept it, and we're going to live anyway, kind of as this result where the universe says, there is no meaning, and we just kind of say, fuck you, we're going to do it anyway. And that's kind of his approach to life. It's this kind of fuck you to the universe, which is why it attracts often very rebellious types. And a lot of his quotes talk about rebellion and living, finding reasons to live anyway, not by ignoring the absurd, not by running from the absurd, but embracing the absurd and deciding to live anyway. And so it's different than nihilism. It's different than existentialism. It's different than Stoicism or Buddhism or any of these other options. And it's really this life of revolt and joy and courage and looking at the absurd and saying, I'm going to live anyway. Like the universe doesn't care. Fine, I'll care. I'll live anyway. And he kind of just has this rebellious spirit that helped him to navigate the situation that we find ourselves in, where we desire for a world that actually really doesn't exist.
Kind of the classic image of Albert Camus is him smoking a cigarette and he's got a little bit of a smirk on his face.
Hmm.
And you can just get a sense of his personality and that revolt and
Yeah.
that rebellion that he
His
had.
quotes are so great. It's like,
Yeah.
should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? And it's like
Right.
when you're in nihilism, it's
Yeah.
so healing just to hear someone else say, should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? Like we're laughing about it, but like
Yep.
we know what that feels like. Like I
Yep.
know what that feels like to be like, should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? And it's almost just like emotionally validating to just hear someone just describe the absurd situation that we find ourselves in. And for someone to just like say it, like, this is insane. We wouldn't have created the world this way. It's quite absurd, this world that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of ways that it started manifesting in my life once I kind of had that
Yeah, I'm
reframing.
curious. Yeah, tell me about that.
One of the funniest ones is I never was a good flosser. Like I never flossed my teeth. And I was reading about this stuff and I was like, man, my teeth are like the weirdest things. There's just like these bones sticking out of my flesh,
Hmm.
and they're meant to crunch up
Hmm.
food so that I can keep living for however long I'm gonna live, and just like the absurdity of that. And then I started flossing my teeth because of it, because I was like, huh, I need to take care of these things, if I don't want them to hurt, so there was just like weird little manifestations, like realizing the absurdity of life and my body and existence and consciousness, and then deciding to just live in it instead of
Hmm.
being like I could just pull all these things out, like it doesn't even matter,
Hmm.
and that
Hmm.
was really, like you said, healing for me.
Yeah, and we can tap into it can be healthy to tap into that energy of recognizing the absurd in a playful way. So the way
Hmm.
I tap into it is like if I'm driving in the car and I'm neurotic, so I'm just like mulling over stuff in some kind of negative bias.
Right.
And I'll just like, if I can catch myself in that moment, I can pull myself out by saying, like, I'm in this meat suit with electricity in my brain, sound waves of this band are hitting my ear and it makes me move in this weird way, and now
Yeah.
I'm singing this song and I'm flying through space
Yeah.
and somehow I'm not like falling off the planet, and I'm in this car that I don't even know how I couldn't invent it. I don't even know like how it's here. And like when you actually take that step back and look at it, it's so fucking absurd. Like what do you mean like sound waves hit my ear and then I just start like kind of moving and singing or whatever. And you can break down any human experience to this playful absurdity and then kind of learn to be in it and laugh in it and even be able to play in it, which is what he ends up being able to do.
Full transparency, I've totally ripped off the saying meat suit from you. It's like my favorite thing you've ever said. I've got a good buddy who has been through a lot of this type of deconstruction too. And so instead of saying, hey, I'm coming over to your house, we'll say something like, hey, I'm going to transport my meat suit in this
Yeah.
aluminum vehicular structure with rubber tires over to your place of domicile, just like just
Yeah.
trying to, tap into that sense of absurdism. So
It's really fun when you can find a couple people that you can play in that way with. So I have two girlfriends where we can like talk in real time about like, oh, my meat suit really didn't like when you said that because it had this, we got made fun of in third grade or whatever, and we can actually talk about like what's happening in us, and then we're kind of playing together and we're kind of watching what our own meat suits do as we interact with each other's meat suits, and we can actually just like talk about that openly, and that is fantastic when you're able to find people to be absurd with.
absolutely. And it
That's
takes the
like one
weight
of the
out of
best
things.
things.
Oh, for
Yeah,
sure.
there
Yeah.
there is a huge difference, and I tell people like living as a nihilist feels like a comet's going to hit the Earth in a year, but instead of just like running around and freaking out about it, like you find a few friends and you're eating popcorn and you're sitting around a fire, and it's like, this is coming. This is just the reality. But there's a big difference between like feeling like you're the only one who knows that the comet's going to hit the Earth and sitting with a few friends and trying a few things and sharing a few things and telling stories. And there's a at the level of experience, there's a difference in those two things, even if our end on this planet is coming and nobody cares that we were here. That may be the reality, but you can learn to kind of sit with it.
Things that just sparked a memory of that video that I mentioned at the beginning of this video here, your Mormon Stories interview you did a year and a half ago. Um, you said something that has stuck with me since then. And it was if I knew a meteor was coming to hit the Earth right now, this is exactly where I would want to be.
Hmm.
And it's that reframing of, okay, I'm going to live my life in a way that and it's not always possible, but I'm always going to be trying to do things that are personally meaningful to me. So that if it was my last moment, that would be okay. I would be okay with that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Before going off into the abyss, right? So that really
Yeah.
stuck with me.
That is the goal. Like there's so many things about nihilism that will feel like it's killing you and you'll feel like you're dying. But that piece is such a golden nugget of going through this process is you get a lot more brave about like, hey, this is absurd and I'm gonna die. Like, why am I living for other people's approval here? And then you start being more authentic and taking bigger risks into what a life of meaning would look like for you. And so now I truly am in a place now where if I had a week to live, I would just keep doing the same things that I'm doing. I have a girls' dinner tomorrow. I have some family things that I'm doing. I have my work and these conversations that I just love. I would make a few TikToks on what I learned that day because I just really enjoy doing that. I would really keep doing exactly what I'm doing. And that is the treasure at the end of the nihilism journey is this real ability to create a life that's worth experiencing. And I don't think I wasn't in that life when I hit my nihilism, which was why it was so hard, but I was able to build it.
Yeah. I think going back to Camus, there are certainly holes in the philosophy of absurdism that we're going to get to, as you mentioned.
Hmm.
But I feel like, and he in the book Myth of Sisyphus, he talks about his three consequences of absurdism, and I feel like they tie closely into what we're talking about. He has revolt, which is like a choosing to live in awareness of the absurd, which you mentioned. Freedom, which is no higher meaning like on the cosmic sense, liberates us to create our own meaning. And then passion, which is living deeply and fully in the present moment. If the meteor's coming, are we doing what we want to be doing in that moment, right?
Hmm.
So I guess we've touched on a few of these, but how can these three consequences, or I guess the way I like to think about it is kind of practical steps that Camus says we can implement absurdism into our life. How do we translate these ideas into spiritual practices like in our daily life?
Yeah. So with revolt, revolt is just this ongoing decision that I'm going to live with eyes wide open. Like I'm not going to go to sleep. I'm going to face the absurd reality that we find ourselves in without denial, without illusion, without false hope. Which is why so many people who I find are absurdists do have a little rebellion in their personality because they're attracted to this sense of revolt. Like I'm going to live with eyes wide open. And so, in practice, what this looks like is I'm not going to look away from death or suffering or meaninglessness. I'm going to build kind of courage to be able to look at it in the eye. So, it's a stance. This is meaningless. I'm going to die. I'm still here anyway. And so, the spiritual equivalent of that is similar to how Buddhism operates, which is the first truth in Buddhism is to look suffering in the eye. Life is suffering. Life is inherently suffering. And so there is a kind of mindful presence in this kind of clear-eyed defiance of choosing to look. And there's a courage in that, and there's a spirituality in that, and there's lots of spiritual traditions like Buddhism that start there. We're going to start by looking at suffering. We're going to start by sitting with our feelings. There are Buddhists who will sit with varying, like corpses in varying degrees of decomposition just to get closer to death, just to eyes wide open, sit next to it. There are Buddhist sects that will remind you 5 times a day that you're going to die. There's even an app that will do that for you if you want an app to do that for you. So that's not unusual in the spiritual space, although I would say Buddhism does that also. But there's this sense of whatever's out there, I'm going to grow to face it rather than hide from it. And I do think there's something really valuable in that, in the sense of you're growing to meet reality. And if you're growing to meet reality, that means that you're building on a strong foundation, because there's nothing that can happen to me that where I am now can really rock me, in the sense of like suffering. I have a container and I have ways to make sense of that. When my daughter almost died, I was able to sit with that. I didn't have any thoughts like, why did this happen to me? Those kind of thoughts. So people dying, me dying, like I just feel like not like that's all going to be hard. I don't like any of it, but I do feel like because I've grown to try to meet reality, then I'm not living in an illusion that can be shattered, because that's what we see with concentration camp or torture victims. The people who die first, and we know this from James Stockdale and the Stockdale paradox. He was someone who was tortured for 7 years in a prisoner of war camp, and we've studied the people who survived. And they asked him who were the ones who were the first to die, and he said the optimists. And the reason the optimists were the first to die is because they built their hope on an illusion. I'm going to be out by Christmas. I'm going to be out soon. And when the illusion shattered, they didn't have enough tools to be able to face that. And they would have what Viktor Frankl called give up itis. They would just roll over and die. And so there is something really beautiful about building a spiritual path with eyes wide open that really resonates with me, because it means that I'm not building on an illusion that reality can shatter at any moment and then leave me just completely without resource. Any thoughts there? I'll stop there before I go on the next one.
Yeah, I mean, it's so I want to use the word imperative or necessary almost, because I think that has always been the thing since starting this process in my life. The thing that has scared me the most is, what do I do when tragedy strikes? And I don't have a
Mm,
good answer for that. And I still don't feel like I have a good answer for that.
mm,
And life hasn't been hunky dory, the past five
yeah.
years. I've dealt with some hard things, but there's a difference between, work sucked today versus my
Mm,
child just died, like those are
mm.
very, that gap between hard and tragedy scares me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I think,
at the beginning of my nihilism, I didn't have tools for suffering or for anything really bad to happen. And that would have just like completely taken me out. But I feel like what got better for me, where I feel more emotional resilience now, is I got super specific, and the people who survived best in concentration camps did the same thing. This is classic Viktor Frankl, of just, I know what my story is. I know what I'm witnessing. I know what my core values are. I know what I'm standing for. I know what I'm standing against. And so I'm so focused in on the story that I'm writing with this meat suit character that whatever is going on, I know how I'm going to respond to it. Now, that means that like totalitarianism can take over, or I could get cancer and die. Like all of those things, yeah, all of those things could happen, but I know how I'm going to choose my response. I know what my story is. And so, even with something like a Trump election, which is concerning on a number of things that we don't need to get into, but the first time I struggled with it more. And this time I struggled with it a lot less. Not because he's any better. In fact, there's less guardrails now than there used to be. But more so because I'm so focused in on I know what I'm doing. I know what my story is. I know how I'm showing up. That essentially like whatever goes on outside of me is what's happening outside of me, and I know how I'm going to respond to it. And that gives you a lot of resilience because like Viktor Frankl says, that's something that even in a concentration camp when everything's taken from you, they couldn't take that from him. And the people who chose, I'm going to show up with humor every day. I need to survive so I can see my kid, and they focused on that. I'm choosing that I'm going to show humanity, and I'm going to stand up for kindness even when the world isn't a kind place, and I'm going to live and die for that. The people who chose this is my story anyway were the ones who were most likely to survive. And when they did survive, they had lower levels of PTSD, even though they saw the most awful things. And so that getting better at that side of my life has given me more resilience to feel like I'll be able to handle some of those tragedies that I know are coming. Hopefully, hopefully. But I feel a little bit better about where I am in that now than maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah. And life gives us so many opportunities to practice, right? With little problems and obviously we can't know when the big stuff is coming, right? And that's always going to blindside you. But being intentional, like you said, and having your eyes wide open to reality, that's really resonating with me right now. So that's good.
Mm.
And
All
there's a
right,
little
ready
bit
to
of
go to
crossover. Yeah, I was just gonna say there's a little
yeah, a
crossover
little.
there with
Yeah, we can.
Stoicism and Buddhism
Oh,
and
yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
other philosophies there. So definitely.
Yeah, Stoicism and Buddhism both will start with like this is the reality. Like we're not going to
Mhm.
sugarcoat this reality. And
Right.
even the Stockdale paradox, which is the guy who survived the torture, it's called the paradox because on one hand, he's recognizing the reality of the truth of his of where he is and what's happening to him, but he's also choosing something that he can believe that's not delusional that he can hold on to. So he decided like this is a big chapter of my life, what's happening to me right here, but it's not going to be my whole life and it's not going to define me, and I'm going to choose how I react to this. And so it's a paradox because he's trying to hold both things. Anyway, we can move into passion now, which is where Camus starts to fall apart a little bit philosophically, or at least his privilege starts to show.
Sure.
So, yeah, Camus says passion is his call to live fully, immediately, sensually, even. And it's this, the quote says, it is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. A man's rule is to die alive, meaning just like engage the senses, food, art, sex, music, movement. Stay awake to beauty while holding the absurdity and don't numb out. And so this is where philosophers are going to disagree with him because if living passionately means pursuing sensory pleasure, then it can really easily turn into hedonism, escapism, addiction, neglect of consequences, that kind of thing. And the problem with Camus is that he doesn't offer any ethical guardrails for the question of if there's no ultimate meaning, why not just chase pleasure? Why not just be a heroin addict and die on your best on your biggest trip and that be your life? Like what, why not? That's going to feel fantastic. And so this is where his own life starts to reflect this tension, and this is where he's going to differ from someone like Viktor Frankl, who saw meaning not just as sensual play but also responsibility. But Camus' life, he has all these he's able to travel the world. He has intellectual affairs. He has passionate affairs. He has maids. He has mistresses. He's just traveling and writing and drinking and having sex with people. And someone else, he's not, he has kids. He doesn't help raise them. He's not an active father at all. And this is where I would say absurdism starts to break down a little bit because if you can't raise your child with it, then is it a really fully fledged philosophy? If you are spreading syphilis everywhere you go, is it really a fully fledged philosophy here? And so there's just a lack here because he talks about living passionately, but he doesn't give us ethical guardrails in the way that other isms will when it comes to separating pleasure from like pure hedonism, where you're just going to, without any responsibility, just do whatever feels good. He doesn't really give an answer for how to avoid that, or if that's something that you should avoid. And so the problem is he's ignoring so Camus' call to live with passion, it doesn't have an ethical structure, and so it can become self-centered, it can become emotional or relational harm. It's kind of a poetic life, but not necessarily a just life. And it's a place where absurdism starts to look really incomplete. And we start to look at his life and say, not everyone can travel the world, just drink and write and be famous and sleep with whoever you want and not raise your kids and have maids to do your chores. Like there's only a few people who can have that kind of life. So if absurdism is only helping that kind of person who has that kind of privilege, then it's really lacking for all the rest of us who have to raise kids and do laundry. And we can't just travel and get drunk and have sex and write and just have a grand old time. And anyway, and a lot of times in his personal life, when things got hard in relationships, he would just run away. He would just say like it's over. He had lots of fallouts with his lovers. He had fallouts with fellow philosophers like Sartre. They had a big, messy, petty falling out. And so there's something for me, especially as a woman, where I'm reading this and I'm like, I'm a mother of 4 children. Relationships are very important to me. I not like I this life that he has, it's not going to be my life. And that's where absurdism started to fall short for me, who has a much more relational life and finds value in relationship. So thoughts there.
Think you hit the nail on the head. It is a it is a privilege to even first be able to think this way, but
Hmm.
then to be able to live the life that he did. Again, like you mentioned, so few people can. I I think, tying it back to what you said at the beginning, there's this balance that is hard to pin down between order and chaos. And Camus' life swung way far on the chaos side, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
and it does, you can see he really lived this philosophy, and the
Yeah.
crossover between absurdism and hedonism is just a few degrees separation sometimes.
Mm.
And I think that's really important for people to understand, when they're reading this type of thing. Is there any sort of wisdom to be gleaned from this third
Yeah,
consequence?
I mean, I do love the idea. The nugget in there that I take with me is building a life at the level of experience. And so that's something that you've heard me talk about. It was a big, big shift in my life of all we're doing is building sandcastles. None of this lasts. None of this matters. And that shift into, okay, what are the kinds of sand castles that are worth building? So that the one of the biggest shifts that you'll make when you're recovering from nihilism is this shift away from ultimate meaning into subjective meaning. That building this sandcastle is meaningful in the experience of it. Me having this conversation with you, we're little kids right now building a sandcastle. We're doing some verbal ping pong. It's enjoyable for both of us, right? It's a kind of way that we're playing and shifting your life into what actually is meaningful and enjoyable and reduces suffering in the world at the level of experience, building my life on that rather than some grand narrative story. Huge shift. really helped me decide how I wanted to my life. It got me back into my body too, because so much of this is headspace stuff. It got into my body of starting to pay attention to where do I suffer less? Oh, I really like conversation. I really like reading. I really like writing. I really like, and so it just brings you back into your body where you're trying to make the roller coaster ride of your existence that ends a ride that's worth experiencing. And that part of it, I think we can salvage from some of his more hedonistic or even selfish edge of it. Because for me, like something that is valuable at the level of experience is relationality. The relationships that I have with my children are very, very meaningful to me, even at the level of experience, even if I will die, even if they will die. And so I think there's something to be gleaned there that we can still have that responsibility. We can still have relationality. We don't have to lose that. But we can still start leaning into life at the level of experience instead of life for some grand narrative story. So that piece I think we can pull out.
It's interesting. If I was living the life that Camus was living, I think I would actually be miserable. Because some of my
And
core
there,
values are
yeah, uh-huh,
loyalty
yeah,
and control of my mental capacity, so I don't want to be high all the time, though it can be fun
yeah,
sometimes, right? Like
yeah,
there's there's things that I enjoy and that bring me pleasure about living maybe a little bit more ethically rigid lifestyle. That
absolutely.
maybe that doesn't fly in the face of this principle
And
of passion.
And he hit a car. I always wonder what his absurdism would have been like if he had lived longer, but he didn't live very long. I think he died in his late 40s, if I remember. But he hits a
Yeah,
car. He never really gets to have a relationship with his children.
yeah,
So of all the fun things that he got to do, those moments where I get to see my child do something new or just do something amazing or just even in the morning just come into my bed and snuggle, and it's just so inherently meaningful to me. He really didn't get to experience that, and I do wonder if yeah, a little bit more responsibility, or if he would have invested in some of his relationships instead of running away. Like my 20 years marriage relationship was hella hard. We married as Mormon dumb 19-year-olds, and we've been multiple people in this marriage. And we keep choosing to remarry each other essentially. But there's something just so valuable about having a long-term partner that witnesses many chapters of you that he never got to experience either. So I do think there's something lacking there that I wonder if he would have developed if he had more time.
the type of person that would even pick up a book by Albert Camus could probably, hopefully, be deconstructed enough to not make him the new prophet. You talk a lot about prophet seeking, right?
Yeah.
He would be a bad prophet to base your life on because yeah, he was kind of a wreck, a brilliant wreck, but a wreck nonetheless.
Hmm. Yeah, and with
Um,
with Mormons, we're definitely going to go through that prophet phase first before usually like that. We'll deconstruct that after Mormonism. So you'll
sure.
probably have a couple prophets. I think mine was probably Sam Harris when I first was leaving.
Yeah, Sam Harris is awesome. So
It's
I
great.
don't blame
But
you on
now,
that one.
like now I'm in a place, yeah, but now I'm in a place where like I can disagree or
Yep.
like some of his political views I may differ on. But at the
Sure.
beginning, it was maybe had a smidge of, prophetic, I'm really liking this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'll
If I'm
follow
being
you into
honest with
battle.
myself.
Yeah, exactly.
A little
Yep.
bit. And now even with Hitch, there's some things that I disagree on where I wouldn't have maybe earlier on. So I feel a lot more um autonomy, I guess, than when I was first leaving Mormonism, and there were certain voices that I gravitated towards.
How do you strike that balance between listening to people who have been through these things that are very smart, obviously, that have studied them, and not making them a profit. But then also there's that other side where you can almost go too far and say, I am always right about everything, and I just take, a
Right.
hodgepodge of different views, and my way of viewing the
Yeah.
world is the best way of viewing the world.
It's really hard because it takes a lot of self-awareness to know where you are on that spectrum. So if you are really struggling and your life is an absolute mess, it's probably better for you to like, I'm gonna lean on Buddha for a little bit. I'm gonna lean on even someone like Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules, which doesn't necessarily resonate with me. There are thousands and thousands of people who were in a rough place in their life, total chaos, and started implementing his 12 rules, and their life got better. Like objectively got better in ways that I can't deny. And so if you're in a lot of chaos and you in control of your life means that it's a dumpster fire, that would be a time to take in some inspiration. Like let's start implementing some isms, some stoicism, some Buddhist practices, the waking up app, the 12 rules. It doesn't really matter, honestly. Just start implementing something. And then the other spectrum, the other side of it is I'm so right about this. I don't need to kind of check myself. And for that, you need to watch debates and you need to spend some time trying to prove yourself wrong. So for people who are very sure of whatever ism that they're a part of, even astrology or something like that, I encourage them to spend a year listening to the people who debunk it, listening to the people who are ex-astrologers, listening to the people who are ex-stoicists, whatever it is, and just get a sense of the shadow side of that thing. And then you can return to it. Like you still can be that thing, but it'll be healthier because you're aware of its shadow side. You're aware of its weaknesses. There's not a single ism that doesn't have a shadow side. So it takes a lot of self-awareness to know where you are on that spectrum. Um, and that's part of the problem is we just often just lack self-awareness to know what tools that we need because that's part of the problem. That's why we're in need. But essentially you just have to kind of gauge in yourself, am I too rigid? Am I sure that the way that I'm doing life or seeing the world is right, in which case I need to check myself because there's some shadows and blind spots I'm not seeing? Or is my life total chaos and implementing some rules or advice from people who seem to be thriving in their life better than I am? If that's where you are, then I would lean that way. And that just takes some self-awareness.
Yeah, it's the great paradox is you always think you're right, otherwise you wouldn't think what you're thinking, right?
It's a paradox because if you ask people, are you wrong about something? The majority of people will say yes, there's something fundamental that I believe that is wrong. And then
Right.
you go through their beliefs, is it this one? Is it this one? And they'll say, no, no, it's not that one. And you go through all of their major beliefs. And conceptually, they'll say, I'm probably wrong about one of these 20 things that I believe. But when you actually ask them, is it this one? They say, absolutely not. I'm sure. And so it's so funny. Like why do we do that? We're so silly.
Well, and how could you? It's like when well, I wouldn't believe that thing if I didn't believe it. So
Right.
it's just like there's
Right.
no, I don't know. It's such a weird thing to think about, but
Yeah, it's
yeah,
our biases.
yeah.
All right, so you
Well,
want to do freedom next?
yeah, let's do freedom.
All right. So freedom is it's one of our existential fears, which you've heard me talk about. But when there's no God, no fate, no universal purpose, no reincarnation, we are either terrifyingly free or beautifully free. And that depends on your personality. People who value freedom as a core value tend to love it. People who really like to know that they're on the right path really struggle with freedom. So in the freedom is just the absence of things that have to be a certain way, and that creates this vacuum where we can create. So the absurd man is what he says. The absurd man is he who is aware of this freedom. You don't have to do anything, but you get to choose what matters. You get to build a personal ethic, not because it's handed to you, but because you've chosen it, and you get to let go a lot of shoulds. You should have a marriage relationship like this. You should make this much money. You should wear these kinds of clothes. Your house should look like this. And the best part of that, the nugget that we can pull out of that is that you have more freedom than you think you do to be able to build a life that's worth living. So for me in this job, it was this expression of I don't know if there's a single person who will get what I'm trying to do with atheistic spirituality, but it's what I want to do. If I could choose what to do in my life, it's what I want to do. So I'm going to try anyway. And I just started talking on TikTok poorly, like just talking. And I started talking on podcasts and I did the program and I started taking clients for like $20 an hour just because I didn't even know if I could do this thing. And eventually I was able to build it into a business that could sustain an income. But at the beginning, it was like, I don't know if this is possible, but it's what I want to do. I want to try anyway. And that, I mean, you hear that from everyone. You hear that from Gary Vee is a great one who has that. The people who have really made a life that they love moved some boundaries that they thought were walls, but were really not as solid walls as they thought they were. So even the home that I live in, we built it so that our living area is very small. We don't have a dining room table. We just have a bar. The bedrooms are really small. They just have beds in it. And then we have a really, really big garage, like an 8-bay garage.
Oh,
And there's
wow.
like ping pong table in there, and there's like a weight room and all their bikes and a trampoline. And we live our life. I was like, if I wanted to live in a house, I would want a really small living area that's really easy to keep clean and a big giant playroom where we could play as a family. And we built our house like that. It's a tiny house attached to a giant garage. And I fucking love it. And like, why do I have to have like, I have a family of 6. We have a pretty big family. Why do I have to have a house that looks like this or that? So we have a tiny house attached to a giant garage, and I just enjoy that. And like little things like that start adding up until your life looks different than everyone else's, and that's a good sign because that means that it's your life. So all of that, I think, a lot of that at least, we can extricate. I think where it starts to fall apart as far as critique is this is where he will kind of fight with Sartre is this idea of responsibility and being a part of like a country and a community. Camus just didn't care about politics at all. And so his freedom was only because he had the ability to travel and he was privileged and he had money. But freedom, we have to start to think about freedom societally too, and you have to maybe engage in that way. And then also it brings up issues with free will because they hadn't started to deconstruct free will yet. So what does freedom look like when you don't believe that we have free will? And that becomes more complicated. But the essence of it, which is the walls that you think you have to do are not as solid as you thought you were, as you thought, were there. I think that piece we can take with us.
Well, you read my mind. I was going to ask if there's some conflict there with that and free will. That was probably the most disturbing part of my recent deconstruction is when I came across that. I was like, oh boy, here we go again. Luckily, by
Mm-hmm.
that point, I felt like I'd started to let go of the idea that I needed to know everything.
Mm.
But that's probably a conversation for another time. That's
Yeah, that's a deep dive. But yeah,
yeah,
the freedom becomes I don't think it's something that can necessarily stop the project, but not having free will certainly complicates things because the way all these philosophers are talking is as if we have choice. So even someone like Nietzsche, like you choose your core values. Well, according to what we know about not having free will, we don't choose our core values.
right.
So
They're
are you really
pre-coded.
free? They're
Yeah.
pre-coded. You don't choose your core values, you discover them. But yet none of these philosophers are into inner work enough to tell you how to discover your own core values. They just assume that they chose them. So now we have to add more work. Now I'm like a mom of four trying to finish the philosophy that Camus and Nietzsche never got to finish because they were felt like they were choosing their core values, and I'm in this place where I feel like we don't. So now I got to figure out where their philosophy ended and the modern conversation kind of kept going, and that's where it can get just a little messy. I really only take people into that place who are already there. I don't think some things I think it's necessary or helpful for everyone to know. Not having free will, I don't know if that's something that everyone needs to know, to be honest.
It's an interesting one. I feel like I'm just barely grasping at it. But I would recommend Sam Harris's work on that for sure. And looking for the looker and some of those ideas that he has can kind of help make it make a little bit
The
more
best,
sense.
yeah, the best debate on it was Sam Harris and Dan Dennett, where they
Mm.
could actually finally really define the difference between not having free will and learning how to work with that, which is Sam Harris, and Dan Dennett, who has a form of compatibilism, who says that, hey, those moments where you can see your pattern and you make the most intentional choice that you can, those moments are close enough to free will and they're coming from us that we may as well call it free will. And so it gets to the crux of what this debate is, which is are those really free, almost transcendent choices that we can make where we can choose to go in a different direction? Is that close enough to free will that we're just going to call it free will, like practically? Or is that not free will because how and why you're choosing to do it in that moment is also still determined by values that you didn't choose? But then you have to do some playful language for now you have to get into the Sam Harris space of like, how do you then make choices knowing that you don't have free will? And I would say that conversation is really only necessary for people who want to think about it. I don't think it's necessary for the average person. That's a lot of like
Well,
semantic philosophy, to
yeah.
be honest. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, it's almost like why do we even say the word choice then? And there's just not a lot of practical application
Yeah,
to your
because
life there.
what Dan Dennett and Sam Harris are doing in their life is similar, but one will call it free will and one will call it not, and that turns into semantics more than anything. And I just don't think it's necessary unless you want to go into that space. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, great. I think we covered uh kind of the meat of what Albert Camus' philosophy was. But why did he call the book The Myth of Sisyphus? And who was Sisyphus and how did he
Yeah,
kind of tie it all together there at the end?
yeah, let's do Sisyphus. So he uses this Greek myth of Sisyphus, who's condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up the hill for eternity. I don't know if this is a video podcast, but I have Sisyphus on my bookshelf behind me,
Yeah, I
where
think
he's
I could
pushing
see
up a
him.
hill,
Uh-huh.
and for eternity he has to push the rock up the hill, and then it rolls down, and so he Camus reimagines Sisyphus not as a victim, but as a hero because he accepts his fate and chooses to live in defiance, that there's no ultimate meaning for pushing the rock up the hill. And he has this famous quote that says, but as Sisyphus is engaged in this work, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. So to Camus, this is the absurd hero. You're acknowledging the absurd. If someone were to ask Sisyphus, is there any purpose of this task? He would say no. There's no meaning for this. But he's choosing to live anyway. He's choosing to push the rock up the hill, and then it goes down and he's going to push it up again. And there's a kind of defiant attitude in that Camus really embodies in his absurdism. And so Camus' challenge then is, what are the rocks worth pushing up the hill just for the plot, as the kids would say? And so that then challenges us to say, what are, even if this is ultimately meaningless, what are the struggles, the journeys, the people, the projects that the rocks that I would want to like push up the hill in my life, even if it's ultimately meaningless. So for me, it's like standing against religion and authoritarianism, trying to build up tools in secularism, to make deconstruction easier for people than it was for me. That's meaningful to me. The people that I want to do life with, my children, that where I want to help them create their own stories. All of those are rocks that I'm choosing to push up a hill, even though the universe doesn't care. But hopefully, I'm so engaged in these things that I find meaningful that one can imagine Britt happy, you know, and that's what Camus is trying to challenge us to do. And so again, there's something in there that I think is valuable, that everything that can take, with the challenge also that he never finishes the story in the sense of, what if you don't have freedom? What do you do then? What if you can't travel the world with your mistresses? What if you are in an authoritarian system that doesn't give you any freedom at all? What if we don't have free will, and so you're not as free as we thought we were? What if you're pushing the rocks up the hill and you're actually not happy because you're suffering, because your life is mostly suffering? What do you do then? Absurdism doesn't have answers to any of those questions. So to me, and this is kind of my closing, going into my closing thoughts here. The best I think of what absurdism gives us is the emotional validation of having someone else say, the first question, and we didn't talk about this quote from Camus, that the first question of philosophy is suicide. And it is so emotionally validating to just hear someone say that they're taking seriously the question of whether or not it's worth it to live. Because when you're in nihilism and you're thinking about this question, you can't really say it out loud, right? Because we don't say those thoughts out loud in society. And you start to feel like, if I say this out loud, I'm going to be sent to an institution, but I don't feel like I'm losing my mind. I feel like I'm just asking a deep question of, is life fundamentally worth living? So I think the best of what absurdism gives us is the emotional validation of someone taking seriously the question of whether it's worth it to be alive. And someone who has gives you the validation that the situation that we find ourselves in as humans is so absurd. Like, when you really think about it, reality is crazier and more mysterious than any of our stories about it. And Mormonism has some crazy stories about reality. I think reality stories about reality are even more insane, of like how we find ourselves here. And it just can just be this landing platform that just feels so emotionally validating to hear someone else say, without you feeling like you're crazy. Because I didn't feel like I'm a crazy suicidal person. It felt like no one else is taking this question seriously about whether we can justify this project of life at all. And I feel like I'm the only one who's thinking about this, and that's making me feel crazy. So all of that can just feel lovely when you're in it. But and it can give you some tools for like live anyway, like that rebellion. And it can give you some tools for what are the rocks that you want to push up the hill. And it can get you start thinking in that direction. But eventually, my take on absurdism is, you're going to have to add in some other isms at some point, some secular humanism, some stoicism, some Buddhism, something. If you're talking about living a life where now you have social responsibility, or you have ethics, or you have relationships that you care about, or you're raising children, or you want to explore spirituality, or you want to explore this in the context of free will, absurdism isn't complete when it talks about that. And the biggest critique of absurdism is that it's a poetic stance, not a full philosophy to live by. Because if the answer of absurdism is just like rebel against the universe, it's like, okay, well, what do I do in this scenario in my really very real life? Absurdism doesn't have an answer. All it has is an attitude. Embrace the absurd and live life anyway. Okay, fine. I'm embracing the absurd. I'm living life anyway. How do I live life? How do I find out who I am? How do I find out what I want? How do I raise kids? Absurdism says, I don't know, but I gave you an attitude. Go go with that attitude and find more, is what absurdism will do. So I think it's a good landing platform. I think it's emotionally validating, but I don't think it's an ism that you can fully live your life by. at least in a way that gets to some of the things that we were talking about, where some ethics in our life, I think, gives us both more meaning and purpose and even joy. And absurdism doesn't really have any guardrails for that. So I just said a lot of things. What came up for you there?
That was a really good critique. And definitely has given me a lot to think about. I think I've seen some of the holes in absurdism, but I think we really fleshed them out during this conversation, which I think is brilliant. And there are definitely tools in there I think I personally will continue to carry with me, as it seems you have as well. But yeah,
Hmm.
I think that's a really good place to end it.
Yeah, so I would say like if someone says I'm an absurdist or I'm meeting a nihilistic client who says I'm an absurdist, I would say great. We have an attitude, we have a stance for how we're going to deal with this,
Yeah.
and then now I know we need to plug in some of the holes here. What are we doing with your morality? What are your core values? What does your inner journey look like? What does your relationships look like? What does your meaning and purpose look like? And we can start to kind of fill in some of those holes. So I don't think we abandon it just because we can critique it. I just think that we should be aware of some of the ideas that he just never got to fully flesh out in his life, and that we may need other tools to fill in that space. But I think it's something, a foundation you can start on. I definitely think it can be like the way you orient yourself, like just the stance by which you orient yourself in the universe. But for a fully fleshed life, I just think we're going to need some more tools too.
It's interesting too, because I think, maybe even before this conversation, I think I would have said maybe I most identify with absurdism. But just calling out, well, actually, you don't because you do these things that actually fly in the face of, this ideology, right? So just calling those out can be helpful too. It's like, oh, maybe I do follow stoicism maybe a little more than I thought I did, right? And
Yeah.
I think those are just interesting thoughts to have anyway.
I will admit, like I would have called myself a pessimistic nihilist at one point. I would have called myself an optimistic nihilist at one point. I would have called myself an absurdist at one point. And I find myself now more I don't know if this isn't right or wrong. It's just kind of where I'm at right now, but I find myself more attracted to the existentialists than I was in the past. And existentialists will put on a little bit more responsibility. And in my nihilism, I just couldn't really make sense of that. Like, why? Like, why be responsible for anything? Like, what's the point? And now I have a little bit more space in my philosophy to see the meaning behind taking on responsibility and the joy and meaning and purpose and relationships that that gives me in my life, which means that at the beginning of my journey, I would have been more absurdist and I would have joined Camus in really condemning the existentialists for their sense of responsibility that just has no grounding. But I find myself leaning more that way as I continue to go. And that doesn't mean like I'm progressing. That's just how I'm changing. So it's interesting to try to define yourself with these terms because even for me, the way that I'm defining myself will continue to change. And the the more I'm able to just allow myself to be in flux, the easier that change is. But yeah, I've been all over this map as far as how to define myself with certain isms.
Yeah, and it's fun. You do get to the point where it's fun to explore the
Yeah.
different isms, right?
Yeah, like
And
once you die, like Mormon Jack died and Mormon Britt died, like once you fully die, it becomes a little bit easier to like, oh, I'm kind of like, I feel like I'm going more this direction, but now I've changed my mind and I find myself going over here. So that part gets easier, but you do have to kind of like die before you can start to play in that way.
yeah, yeah, the you can't assign it so much meaning and self-worth to what you are, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great. Britt, really appreciate your time today. This has been a wonderful conversation. For me, it's been excellent. What are maybe just like your final thoughts, final takeaways, and what you're excited about and what you're working on before we go?
Yeah, so if you want to dig more into Camus, You can read like you did. You can pick up Myth of Sisyphus and kind of sift through firsthand philosophy. I used to do that more, to be honest, since I've had four kids and my brain can hold less space for firsthand philosophy. Sometimes I tend towards describers of the philosophy kind of books. So if you want that, if you want, someone who does an analysis of absurdism rather than reading direct philosophy, which sometimes can be very dense, I recommend Camus and the Meaning of Life. Is a highly readable book, both on Camus' life and his writings, and how that relates to modern meaning making. So I'd recommend that. And then there's lots of podcasts and lectures. YouTube does. There's the Academy of Ideas that does a really good job on doing Camus and the absurd. There's the Partially Examined Life, which is a podcast that does absurdism. So even just listening to YouTubes on this can really helpful if you don't want to read, The Stranger, The Myth of Sisyphus, things like that. And then as far as me, what I'm doing, I am full of clients for the month of May, and then I'm taking the summer off with my kids to be home with my children, and then I'll be back in the fall. And then what I'm kind of leaning into is I'm finishing a book on existential crisis specifically and the void specifically. So I'm about 9 chapters into that book. And so I'm working on that. And then I'm joining the Center of Non-Religious Spirituality to help spiritual directors to help train people to essentially do what I'm doing. So I'll be starting that in the fall. So
Amazing.
that's what I'm doing. Those are the rocks that I'm pushing up the hill because fuck you, universe. That's
That's
what I'm
exactly
doing.
right. That's awesome. Well, great. Excited for your book. Excited to, keep consuming your content. Thank you for what you do. And yeah, again, just really appreciate you being on today.
This was so enjoyable. The time just flew by for me. We
Yeah,
built some fantastic sandcastles today.
absolutely. Thanks for doing that.
All right, my pleasure.